In this video, I'll be sitting down with Mike Weider, CEO of Frugal, and we're going to have a conversation about how AI changes the economics of software. So, for the last 20 years, SaaS has operated on the same basic principle that once the platform is built, adding new customers or clients costs almost nothing. That's what was able to produce 90% gross margins, and that's what made SaaS the best model in tech up until now. AI changes that completely. AI native companies are reporting significantly lower margins at around 50 or 60%, which is a far cry from what we've been accustomed to in the SaaS model. So, I had a chance to sit down with Mike and talk about exactly what's happening, why conventional tools can't fix this, and what companies that are actually getting ahead of this are doing right now. Take a look.
AI is kind of jeopardizing the fundamental unit economics of SaaS software. 80%, they're more like 50 to 60%. And so there's a huge delta in the gross margins of AI businesses, in that these tokens are pretty darn expensive. In AI, that's never true, right? And so your unit economics are vastly different. Developers write code, they push it to production, you wait until the bills come in. They don't even have visibility into the bills. They have no idea, what their code is, implications on cost. We see a future where cost, just like security, just like quality, just like every application, in code change will get reviewed for cost prior to deployment. That, I think, is an inevitability.
So, why don't we start by just talking a little bit about yourself and what we're doing here today?
Sure, yeah. So my background, I've been working in the building startups for the last 30 years, and this is Frugal is actually my fourth company, and previously we worked on security software to check for vulnerabilities in code. We worked on a performance optimization company that looked at the performance of code, and now with Frugal, we're looking at the cost in code. So been working in the sort of code analysis and developer tooling space for a long time, and really excited to work on a brand new project, bringing with AI and also addressing an important cost, which is the sort of painful cloud bills that anyone who's building software is probably aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody's talking about how that is spiraling out of control really quickly with AI, especially. So, what made the SaaS margins so attractive in the first place?
Well, if you think about it, so we've had SaaS, their cloud software now for almost 20 years, and it was incredible innovation that allowed people to get out of running servers and outsource that job to Amazon or Google or somebody else. And very, very easy to get started, but also very easy to spend money really quickly. But what made SaaS margins pretty incredible was economies of scale. And so typically, SaaS vendors would have gross margins in the 70 to 90% range, but typically 80% is pretty common. And what's amazing is that the variable cost typically has been almost zero. So you spend a lot of money upfront to build the system, but then every incremental customer you add is kind of negligible. So for Salesforce or for Shopify, adding that additional customer doesn't really move the needle. And so as you scale, as you grow, you can leverage those economies of scale and get extremely profitable returns. But it also enables other business models like freemium, for example, where you can have 90% of people, or not even 95%, not paying and being supported by the 5% of cohorts that pay. So it was a great business model, and one that's kind of served us well for the last 20 years or so, but is now maybe threatened a little bit.
How so? Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think everybody's writing and lots of chatter about the SaaS apocalypse, and all of the doom and gloom about the end of software companies that AI is going to destroy. And mostly, I think what people have been talking about is that there's a narrative out there that no one will buy software anymore, that will just kind of vibe code our way to build what we need on the fly, and that AI is going to magically sort of create all of the enterprise software and no one will need subscriptions anymore. And so you've seen the stocks of everybody from Figma to Monday.com to ServiceNow and so forth. These high-flying companies have seen their stock prices go down by 50% or more under this notion that nobody will need them in the future. And I think that's kind of misgiven. in that personally, having built enterprise software and seeing how long it takes to install it and integrate it, and also just the complexity to actually create something that really, really works and works securely, that I really do not think that enterprises are going to just vibe their own software every day instead of buying that. So personally, I think that's a little bit overblown, that risk. However, there's another risk maybe that doesn't get talked about as much, which I think is very, very real, which is kind of related to our conversation, which is that AI is kind of jeopardizing the fundamental unit economics of SaaS software. In that, if you look at AI native companies, their gross margins are not 80%, they're more like 50 to 60%. And so there's a huge delta in the gross margins of AI businesses, in that these tokens are pretty darn expensive. And so it costs a lot more to run an AI company than it does a traditional SaaS company.
Right. You touched on some really great points there. AI is not yet ready to be dealing with enterprise vibe coding. That's for sure. So what's the difference there then? Why can't AI native companies manage spend just like they used to with like cloud billing?
So we were talking about, the variable costs in a SaaS company as being almost negligible. Well, in AI, that's just not true, right? The cost of actually running your software for each customer can be quite significant. And so not only are you dealing with a gross margin issue, which is that SaaS companies, well, if they weren't profitable at 80% margins, if you take away another 20%, well, that's not making your life any easier, right? And so there's even bigger maybe questions about how someone gets to profitability. But the other point is that the path, typically in the past, the answer was scale. Add more customers, and eventually, you've overcome that initial expense, and you're into the gravy where every incremental customer is kind of free. In AI, that's never true, right? And so your unit economics are vastly different. And so I think it puts a brand new challenge on top of companies to, first of all, figure out, how do I run a profitable company with 20% less margins than I had previously? But also, secondarily, how do I deal with the new reality of unit economics, which is that every new customer actually can be quite expensive, and I need to protect myself against the instance where a certain customer could run up a bunch of token costs on me, and that might exceed the revenue I'm getting from them.
And what sort of optics do we have for that right now? Like, is there any sort of software that is sort of the fallback to see exactly what that cost is per customer?
Well, so if you look at how costs have been measured in the cloud era, typically there would be some FinOps tooling there that would read in your Amazon bills and your Azure bills and your GCP bills and your Datadog bills, and kind of give you a sense for what you're spending across your organization. And those things still exist, but the challenge is that most of the measurement systems are very high level. They'll tell you kind of what your overall spend is, but they don't tell you that down to the specifics of what in your code is kind of driving these costs. And so in the SaaS era, you had a lot of cost on compute and on infrastructure, that upfront cost that you had to sort of build the infrastructure. Well, in the AI world, more of the cost is being driven by the actual code of the application, not necessarily the infrastructure that it's running on. And so it's about how many tokens you're consuming in your application. And that requires a kind of new set of tooling to really get under the covers and understand what the heck is the code doing to drive costs, which is maybe a new muscle that hasn't been needed in the past and therefore needs to be built for most companies.
Right. And that's what you guys do. That's what you built. It's a perfect segue. Yeah.
Yeah, which is this sort of notion that developers are writing code, and mostly cost control is sort of reactive. What happens is that developers write code, they push it to production. You wait until the bills come in, and then we look to say, to do something about them. And so there's often a big time delay between when the code was actually written to when these, you start to get better visibility. And then by the time you get that visibility and you go back to talk to these devs, well, they've already moved on to a million other things, and nobody ever wants to go back and look at things and look at how to refactor the code and look at those decisions we made to say, were they the right ones, and how do we optimize that? And so what Frugal is trying to do is to engage developers in the cost equation. And this has been a challenge in the past because devs are busy, they're building features, they're trying to deliver on their goals and their deadlines, and they don't even have visibility into the bills. They have no idea what their code is, how the code changes that they're pushing have implications on cost. And so what we're trying to do is fix that by embedding cost reviews throughout the software development lifecycle, so that when you're a developer and you're creating a new pull request, for example, you would know, first of all, what is this code today costing? What is the incremental cost of the code change that you're putting forward? So how much does it change it, plus or minus? And then also, are there suggestions that we have to make the code more efficient and to reduce the cost? And so just gaining visibility is a huge step forward because, as we said, people were mostly blind previously. So that's kind of, innovation one. Innovation two is building, automated software to come up with, recommendations on how to reduce those costs.
Perfect. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt there, but I just had it's really unique that you said it's a new muscle to exercise there, because even in my experience, it's always just, does this work? Not how much is this going to cost us down the line, right? So it's an angle that I don't think a lot of us have really looked at before, right? But now it's getting more and more important. Absolutely. So really well said.
Yeah, I guess I have just maybe one point to make, is that this is not necessarily a new motion in the sense that, I was giving my background on security and performance, and in security, what used to happen is that developers would write applications, and at the end of that process, some pen tester would beat it up and find issues and kick those back to dev, and they'd fix those, and so on in that loop. And then we discovered, hey, that's kind of inefficient, and wouldn't it be better if we just caught this stuff up front? And slowly but surely, we began to accept that, and now most shops have some level of security code review in their pre-deployment process. And the future is definitely that this exact same situation is going to happen for cost. And AI is kind of, tipping the scales for people to push them in. But even without that, these costs were painful, and people could have benefited from a more proactive review. And so, we see a future where costs, just like security, just like quality, just like performance and reliability, other, non-functional requirements, our cost is every application, and code change will get reviewed for cost prior to deployment. And that I think is an inevitability, just given how economics are changing for software.
Right. Absolutely. So what are you seeing then? Because I feel like a lot of people in this situation are maybe even ignorant to how much they're wasting. They just see the bill and accept it. So in practice, what does this look like typically for you that you've seen? I guess how urgent is this for folks to be implementing?
I mean, I think it depends, what kind of software you're working on, but in Cloud Era 1, it was most about lift and shift of, workloads that were running on servers, and we just moved them to the cloud. And it was mostly about infrastructure. And so, optimization of costs was about utilization, or finding a server that nobody's using anymore, or maybe it was, running and I'm paying the bills, but nobody's using, or is just over provision, for example. In the second era, we'll call it sort of cloud native software, where I'm building for the cloud. Now I'm using services, and I'm leveraging lots of APIs. I might be, instrumenting things with Datadog. I'm using storage. I may be using serverless, and all those things now, all these services or API calls maybe add up to 50% of my costs. And then in the cloud era, or in the AI era, you stack on top of that the token costs, and all of a sudden that could be more like 80%, and now 20% is the infrastructure. So we've kind of flipped the models from infrastructure being 80% of your bill, services being 20, to now in the AI era, it's the opposite. And so the more services that they're using, the more the code matters, because it's the thing driving the bills, have a huge lever on your costs. And so that, I think, makes the imperative for those companies building for cloud native software or building for AI native software. Well, the cost implications of their code are that much higher.
Are massive. Wow. I didn't realize it was that high. Wild. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mike. Any closing notes?
Yeah, no, great talking to you, Eric. I mean, I think it's a brand new world, and what we see, most of our developers are leveraging Claude and Cursor and all these tools, and and the amount of code that's being produced now is insane compared to what it was 6 months ago, or even less. And so I think that's the other maybe factor in this, which is that AI is good at generating very high volumes of code, but not always the best quality code, right, or the most efficient code. And so I think that's a sort of another point maybe for people to begin to focus on efficiency and cost, is to make sure that as we grow the volume of code that we're producing, that we're doing that in a very efficient way, that cost is sort of factored into those decisions. Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, great talking to you, Mike. Love to see what you guys are doing at Frugal. Really, really great difference maker for sure.
Thanks, Eric. Great talking to you as well. And yeah, have a good one.
So there you have it. That's the reality of building software in 2026, keeping into account engineering costs, token usage, and how this all works together to affect your gross margin. I'd like to thank Mike again for taking the time to sit down and walk us all through this. If you'd like to learn more about how Mike and Frugal solved this issue, you can book a free founder-led demo in the description. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next one.